Welcome, everyone. Today, we are joined by Bob Zeller, the president of the Center for Civil War Photography. Thank you for joining us, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Please tell us a bit about your background, where you grew up, where you went to school, where you live, and your profession.
Well, I'm a classic baby boomer, born in 1952 in Washington, D.C. When I was 4 years old, my family moved out to a split level house in the suburbs, and I grew up in the suburbs of Maryland, Hyattsville. With a little bit of history nearby, and old 19th century home, and but I went to high school there and went to the University of Missouri to study journalism. I kind of learned through school that well, I did best on writing tests rather than, say, multiple choice or good memory test. If I could write an essay, I was in good shape. So I became a reporter after the University of Missouri, worked in Springfield, Missouri for a couple of years, Jackson, Mississippi for 4 years. And then during the 80s, I was in at the Long Beach Press-Telegram. And my career wasn't going exactly as I had hoped. So kind of threw my legitimate newspapering career away and went and covered auto racing and covered NASCAR. Basically, I ended up making my hobbies my job. That's kind of the background in terms of my personal thing. And with the Civil War, I have connections. My dad's from Hagerstown, and my grandmother is from Burkittsville, and the Poffenberger family on the Antietam battlefield. My grandmother's great uncle was Samuel Poffenberger, who had a farm on the battlefield where Clara Barton practiced. At age 10, at the centennial, my uncle gave the sermon at the rededication church service of the Dunkard Church, which had been rebuilt in 1962. So I was there. And that I was always interested in history. Maybe got a little away from it during college, but my parents bought a piece of property. My dad wanted a piece of property up near, Hagerstown in Washington County, a piece of woodlands on a small mountain that ended up overlooking the Antietam battlefield. So that really reignited my interest. I was also a dunker, actually. I was raised in the Church of the Brethren. I was dunked in a tub behind the altar in University Park, Maryland, Church of the Brethren. But so with the land at Antietam and me being a journalist, I became very interested in Antietam and kind of figured out around 1979-80 when the antique Civil War dealers were beginning to pop up that you could collect stuff. And I started collecting Antietam newspapers and photographs. It kind of a big moment came in October 1980. I'd had this stereo viewer since I was 13 years old. It was my first antique, and I had my little collection of stereo view cards. But it was not until 1980, when I was 28 years old, that I found out really for the first time, and I should have seen it before then with the Viewmaster Civil War set and other things, but I missed it until I was 28. I was at a dealer's house in Gettysburg, D. Mark Katz, and he pulled out this Antietam original Gardner stereoscopic view of Bloody Lane, and my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that it went back that far. But the instant I saw this old flat mount card, I knew it was really old. And so I started collecting the photographs as well. Antietam was the first battle where American dead were photographed on the battlefield. And that's kind of where things went after that. In the For the 80s, throughout the 80s and the 90s, or the early part of the 90s, I was really a hobbyist. Then in the early 90s, things started to happen. I made a couple of discoveries, and I managed to talk my way into an exhibition of my growing Antietam photo collection at the Southeast Museum of Photography. And then couldn't believe that 3D photography of the Civil War. I mean, the photography of the Civil War is the single most graphic and compelling thing that links us, that allows us to relate to the war. And yet, an even more compelling aspect, the fact that most of it was shot in 3D, was completely ignored. And so I got a contract about 1995 to do a 3D photo history with Chronicle Books, my first book, The Civil War in Depth. And I remember it was going to be 2 years before the book came out. I was like, oh, I don't know if we can wait that long. Somebody else is going to do this first, but they didn't. So I had the privilege and honor of doing the first 3D photo history of the war, a very thin volume here, Civil War in Depth, but came with a viewer in the back of the book. And it made a nice splash. I got a review in the New York Times Book Review, and I got a second book, the sequel, and also with Chronicle Books in San Francisco, a wonderful publisher. Was able to do in the early 2000s with John Richter, Lincoln in 3D. So I've done three 3D books, and also written a history of Civil War photography called The Blue and Gray and Black and White.
So are they still in print?
No, they're not, but you can get them easily on Amazon and cheap. So pretty easy to get. Any of the, well, Blue and Gray is a little tough, but it's still available.
So I have yet to see a gray and blue publication. Why? So tell us, what exactly is the Center for Civil War Photography? Its history, mission, and activities.
It's an educational organization, an enthusiast organization. We do not have a physical headquarters. We've always been kind of a virtual organization. We've had one part-time employee, Jennifer Kahn, who joined us when she was in college at age 19 in 2001, and has been with us ever since as our single part-time employee. We have about 150 members. We are a membership organization. Our key things are we have an annual Image of War seminar at various battlefields. We were going to Gettysburg this year and it got COVIDed out. But we also have a website, civilwarphotography.org, which has a lot of information on it, including primary resource information. And then we publish 3 times a year a historical journal, Battlefield Photographer. And this is 85% full of history articles, photo history articles, as opposed to newsletter about modern stuff. We usually have 2 or 3 history articles in each issue, and in each issue, or almost every issue, we publish a photo that has never been published on the printed page, to the best of our knowledge. And we've never had a problem finding photos that haven't seen the light of day. So at least in our modern times. In our latest issue in April, we have yet another photograph number 103, I think it is, of dead on the battlefield, Confederate dead on the battlefield. It's an unknown location at this point, but it's one of the things that ties me most intimately to study of Civil War photography is that sense of discovery. You know, I don't have to get in scuba gear and go to the bottom of the ocean to find the gold. It's there. It comes up. It flushes its way out on eBay and other sources, dealers, antique photo dealers, and there's several different levels of discovery. Finding new images, finding details within known existing images. There's several different, finding out the information behind the photograph. Ron Coddington at Military Images. So I sort of specialize in the documentary photos and he specializes in the portraiture. And that's the way Battlefield Photographer is more focused towards the documentary photos, although we have had articles about portraits. And Military Images is, which is just an outstanding publication, focuses more towards portraiture. And Ron has made a career of finding out the soldier stories of these various photographs of portraits of soldiers.
So is the center a nonprofit, a 501c3?
Yeah, it's a 501c3, and I've been the president since the start. It goes back to 1999, and myself and Rob Gibson, who's a wet plate photographer in Gettysburg, and the late Al Benson, who was a Confederate reenactor, were sitting in O'Rourke's on Steinway Avenue in Gettysburg, and we kind of just sat there and decided, you know, somebody needs to start an organization, and that's where the idea was born. But about 2 years later, it actually began to take life when Gary Edelman, who's the director of history and education at the American Battlefield Trust and has been our vice president since the beginning, and Chuck Morangello, who's an insurance guy in Florida and also a brilliant guitarist, was Marty Balin's guitarist in Marty's later career. They pushed us forward in terms of actually getting the 501c3 and incorporating and getting something started. And in the beginning, we were going to build a museum until we found out how tough it is. And, you know, it's basically a nonstop fundraising job, because the best you can do with a museum is maybe with your budget, 30% of your budget might be walk-in if you're lucky. So you have to just constantly fundraise. And with photography, often with the prints, archivally, you're not supposed to display them longer than a few months. So there were just a lot of complications that made a lot of sense to us to remain a virtual organization. Get together once a year.
Excellent. So what is the relationship between the center and the American Battlefield Trust?
Well, the key relationship obviously is Gary, our vice president, who is also the history and education leader at the American Battlefield Trust. I have been a freelance, self-employed writer since 1998, and my main client for the past number of years has been the American Battlefield Trust. I do everything from press releases to Wikipedia work to writing the history of battlefield preservation and the Civil War Trust, fighting the Second Civil War. That's my latest book. They also very generously help sponsor our annual Image of War seminar. And there is no direct company connection, however. We're an independent organization.
So why is the study of 19th century photos of the Civil War era important?
Well, for about 100 years or more, Civil War photography basically appeared as illustrations, window dressing, as it were, in books. There were compilations, and that's the other way that they appeared, is the first book of Civil War photographs where they were printed on the pages of the book was the Memorial War book in 1890, and it had about 2,000 illustrations in it by Brady and Gardner. And then in 1911 came the 10-volume photographic history of the Civil War, better known as Miller's photographic history, because Miller was the editor of the thing, but it was a 10-volume photographic history of the war, which you would think with the number of pictures in that thing, I mean, it's this wide, all 10 volumes, that was the end of it. There would be no more Civil War photography. You know, no more photographs to be found. But then Jack Davis in the 80s did the 6-volume, this big image of war, and you know, has more, I think more than 1,000 previously unpublished photos on the printed page in that book. And they were coming to him, you know, every day. For him, the sense of discovery. We're lucky if, you know, every few months, he lectured to our seminar one time and was telling us, you know, how the mail just brought new images every day. So, but really the key time was with William A. Frasinito, Bill Frasinito's Gettysburg: A Journey in Time, published by Scribner's in 1975. It was a sensation because it was the first book that really tried to look at the photographs for what the photographs meant and the information that they held. And Bill pioneered the concept of studying the photography for the historical information that was contained within. One of the Gettysburg photographs of the dead, when he started his studies as a college student, there were 4 different locations identified in various books over the years as to where it was, and none of them were correct, none of them. And so he started finding the original locations of these photos of the dead at Gettysburg and the other photos. There's about 40 photographs of the dead at Gettysburg. And from that, for instance, a group of the photos of the dead, not all of them, but certainly more than a dozen, were taken on the Rose Farm. And before that, the Rose Farm was kind of just an obscure place that happened to be on the battlefield. And he was able to establish through the photography and then studying as much as he could of all other sources, just how key this area was during the second day's battle. And it really was an eye-opening study. And then he did one on Antietam. And he also did Grant and Lee in Virginia, 1864, and really began to make Civil War photography more significant in the general world, the field of Civil War studies, because of this pioneering historical research that he did on the photographs. I've always been thankful to Bill that he left the 3D aspect. He talked about the 3D, but he didn't really delve into the 3D as 3D photos. He produced the 3D photos as 2D photos like they are in most books. And so by leaving me the 3D aspect, which is something that, you know, fascinated me since childhood, was just a real treasure for me.
So can you tell us what an Anaglyph 3D image is?
Well, an Anaglyph 3D image is a conversion, just basically to explain, a 3D photograph is taken with a camera that has 2 lenses, an eye width apart. There's actually a modern camera they have. I don't think it's, but this is actually a modern 3D camera, and you can see the 2 lenses an eye width apart. And if you take 2 photographs with those 2 lenses, 2 slightly different photographs, then you see in depth because each eye sees a slightly different view. So if you take those two slightly different photographs, mimicking what the eye sees, and convert and combine them into a single image, you get the optical illusion of 3D. This goes back to the beginning of photography, basically. Photography was introduced in 1839, and by the 1840s, and this is actually 1850s, you had daguerreotypes, which were photos on silver plates. You can't see it because of the reflection, but this is an 1850s Viewmaster, I call it, a 3D view of a daguerreotype with its own built-in viewer. This is 1855. This is before the Civil War. So 3D was part of the whole photography scene from the very beginning. And once the wet plate photograph came into being, and you could make numerous unlimited copies on photographic print paper, then the marketing, and that came in the late 1850s, basically. So the beginning of the Civil War corresponded with this boom in photography and the actual selling of images. And the Antietam series by Gardner, they have labels on the back, and they have numbers. They're one of the first collectible card sets with numbers. Now, in a modern technique, to answer your question, I mean, you can look at them through a viewer that has two lenses and combines the views together. The Anaglyph 3D, you're basically converting the two photographs, and you're putting a red and blue overlay. And then, say the red's on the right and the blue's on the left. Then you put on glasses that have red and blue lenses, the red on the left, the blue on the right. And it's just a way to trick your brain, combine those pictures into a single, there you go. It's just one of the ways to force your brain to see those two images together in 3D. And the thing about Anaglyph is that it adds color to the whole situation. But the thing about Civil War photography is that most of these pictures are in black and white, so the color does not disrupt color. I resisted for many years using the Anaglyph method. I used another method for my slideshows, where you used polarizing lenses, which basically polarize one photo vertically, and another horizontally, and then the two lenses are opposite and it combines. Mm-hmm. And that took the color out of it. But the advantage of the Anaglyph is that you can make a print. You can print photos at any size you want. With the polarizing glasses, you are limited, but with the Anaglyph 3D and my most recent 3D book, Lincoln in 3D, we have 2-page spreads of like Richmond Panorama by Alexander Gardner in 3D. And so you can do so much more with it. And because the Civil War photography is either black and white or sepia tone prints, it works great.
I know that some of your, if not almost all of the publications from the center have 3D images, and wearing these kind of glasses really does make it 3D, and for stuff to stand out. It's actually a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's when you can see the lay of the land and how the land dips and flows, like in some of the Antietam photographs, you really get a better sense for the battlefield. It's an element that adds to the it's an immersive sort of thing. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a great essayist during the war, was also a huge 3D guy, and they sent him 3D pictures all the time. And as he described it, your mind feels its way into the very depths of the photograph. Now, you've got a typical photograph, like a card photograph of a of an individual, and that's a family keepsake. But what the 3D photograph did with this viewer, your eyes go under the hood of the viewer. It's a photographic viewing experience. It's the video of Civil War America, literally, when there was no actual video. It's more than just looking at a photograph.
It really does make things come alive. So what's the most cost-effective way of viewing stereo photo cards?
Most cost-effective. It's called a lorgnette viewer. LORNGNETTE. Lorgnette viewer. And I looked online, and you can get one. You can pay Amazon $15 for one, but if you look just a couple of for entries lower, there's two 3D suppliers who sell these little lorgnette viewers for $3.50. So that's the cheapest way I know, is go online and buy one of these convergent lenses viewers, and these are perfect for viewing the actual stereo views like this. It just brings them right out. So that's the cheapest way.
Ah, all right. So I imagine that all of the Civil War photographs have been found and curated, right?
No, there's still plenty to be found. Either through just something surfacing. Often a lot of the discoveries that we've been making recently are repositories scattered around the nation. I mean, you can find Civil War photograph collections of one sort or another in, several dozen or more archives or libraries. And these have been more or less hidden. But in the last 15 years, actually, really kind of almost beginning with the Library of Congress, which has the original negatives, hundreds and hundreds of stereo views, and also prints. Well, they started in the early 2000s scanning everything they had and putting it online and making it available. And lots of museums have been doing that. And so one of our big discoveries a year or so ago was the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts, has 700 Civil War stereo views. Some Civil War veteran who collected them or whatever, donated to them. And they scan them and put them online. And one of our members was kind of browsing through them, and they suggested that I take a look, because there was a series of more than 130 stereo views taken as part of an expedition in 1866 down into Virginia. Really the first photographs of like the wilderness in Chancellorsville. There's a few, but for the most part, these were the first. We knew about them. We knew 50 or 60 of them, and we knew there was an index with lots of gaps. And this American Antiquarian Society happened to have a fairly extensive collection, and all of a sudden there's like a dozen stereo views from this series that we had not seen before. So we did almost a whole issue on those. So that's often the way that they're coming. Right now, one of our writers is preparing an article on a Beaufort, South Carolina photographer named Erastus Hubbard. It turns out the Beaufort County Library has a huge collection of his stereo views. And he captured both military operations and also the Port Royal experiment, which was basically the North having to respond. Beaufort was one of the first Southern strongholds captured by the North in November 1861, I think it was. And all the slaveholders and plantation owners fled, leaving thousands of slaves on these plantations to make do on their own. And the Port Royal experiment was an effort to try to bring schooling and other needed services in, and that was extensively photographed by Erastus Hubbard. And it's almost all stereo, and he took what's known as hyper stereo, which is if you spread the width apart in the two lenses when you take the picture, it increases the illusion of depth. And so these are incredible 3D views. And Keith Brady, who's just this really unparalleled, or one of the best collectors. He's found all sorts of stuff just digging and digging. So he has a whole bunch of views in his own collection, and the Beaufort County Library has views in other museums, and many of them have never been published, on the printed page. One thing in Battlefield Photographer I thought I'd mention also is that in every issue we have at least one 3D Anaglyph. And all our members get glasses. And when you join the Center for Civil War Photography, $45 a year, you can do it online. You get a pair of glasses, 3D paper glasses. And so we always have the 3D aspect covered in our publication, as it should be. Because a majority of Civil War documentary photographs, I think 70%, based on my years of study, were taken in 3D and meant to be seen that way. And were seen that way by the people of the era. When I first did my first book, it was, man, well, people of this era need to be able to see that too. And it's really grown too. There's lots of people doing 3D stuff with the photography, colorizing. Our member David Richardson does a lot of colorizing, and of course they colorized back then too. It's important to understand that Civil War photography was marketed back then. So you had the stereo view, okay, and then Alexander Gardner also marketed, and Brady, actually with Brady, these were called Brady album gallery cards. That's a half stereo, but full frame, 4 by 5 inches. The glass plate negative was 10 by 4 inches with 2 photographs on it. And then they also used a large plate camera. And this was an original albumin print from Antietam, unmounted, a 7 by 9 inches that they used to take photographs. And Gardner took about 1,200 stereoscopic views during the war, and they're all cataloged. Most of the negatives still exist. They didn't end up as greenhouse glass. And there were a number that were broken over the years, but for the past 30 years, if they broke one at the Library of Congress, didn't happen very often, but if they did, they took every piece of glass and put it in its own separate little archival envelope and kept them. One of them, there's like 15 different pieces. And when they got around to doing the scanning project in the 2000s, they actually put the puzzle back together on the scanning bed with the photograph and scanned it and made it available. And of course, with Photoshop, you can actually retrieve that photograph. But they have the original negatives, but also, hundreds and hundreds of prints. And including some what were called imperial size prints. These were panes of glass that were like 14 by 18 inches, and the gigantic camera, and they'd make prints that size. So with these negatives being as large as they were, stereo being 4 by 10, there's an immense amount of detail in these photographs. It's basically just like black and white film, but except they used glass, but because of the size. I mean, in our time, before digital cameras, if you wanted a really high resolution, sharp picture, you took a picture with a 2 1/4 camera, 2 1/4 inch thing. Well, these were 4 by 5 inches, the original stereo, half stereo. So another area of just immense amount of progress we've made, many, many, many discoveries have been in the depths of these glass plate negatives. Discoveries and controversies.
So you know where I'm going with these next questions. Without letting the cat out of the proverbial bag, we have been told that provenance is an important aspect of authenticating Civil War photographs. Can you tell us what provenance is and what constitutes bulletproof provenance?
Well, provenance is just a record of the photograph, or other documents or collectibles. But in terms of Civil War photographs, it's um, the the information that establishes um, who the photograph is of, or what the photograph shows. Um, with provenance, for instance, if the sitter, say it's a portrait of a Union general, if his signature is on it, well, first of all, with many Union generals, you can tell just visually, yeah, that's McClellan, or yeah, that's Burnside. But let's take a lesser known person. Provenance is the fact that that person wrote his name on the back of the card, establishing who it is. Provenance is the fact that the photograph, which has a picture of a soldier or an officer, but nothing else, is also attached or part of a letter that it says, this picture is so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. That's provenance. And there's degrees of provenance, but generally you can't just, anyway, I mean, I think that pretty well answers it.
All right. So I know you watched the Discovery Channel's program, Undiscovered: The Lost Lincoln. What do you think of the authenticity of that?
I don't think it is. My first reaction in looking at it was that it didn't look at all like Lincoln. And that's kind of where I was going with the provenance thing when I stumbled there, is because the provenance that they have is an oral history. It's so-and-so has said that this Union officer who was in charge of Lincoln's body gave this photograph to a member of the Hanks family. If there was written documentation, and that I forget what his name is in the show, but that officer had written a page saying this photograph was taken, da 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 da, and signed it. That's provenance. I mean, that's strong documentation. But the oral history, and then these tortured facial comparison studies, that's certainly not the first one they're used in that show, and it certainly won't be the last. And in fact, that's not the first would-be Lincoln. It's not even the first Lincoln in death photograph. Would-be photographs. If you go online, you'll find a couple of others. I think when they spent 2 hours kind of building up the drama, they spent a good bit of time establishing facts that everybody would understand right off the bat. There was a segment for I don't know how many minutes establishing that a ball out of a Derringer does not have the penetrating power of an AR-15. Well, of course it doesn't. They also spent a long time establishing that there were a couple of photographers who lived in the Peterson house, and they did take 2 photographs at least of the deathbed after Lincoln's body had been removed, and those are prints. The photograph, the lost Lincoln photograph, is an ambrotype, and it's in an 1850s case. And the ambrotype, they spent a good bit of time on the show establishing that the Ulke brothers, who were the 2 photographers at the Peterson house, took ambrotypes. Well, every photographer in that era took all the different forms of photography, ambrotypes, tintypes, glass plate negatives, in order to be able to compete with the other photographers. And photographer ads back then routinely talked about all the different formats that they took pictures in. So, I would have automatically conceded, yeah, the Ulke brothers took the ambrotypes, but the provenance, just the oral history is not enough. There's just not enough proof. And he doesn't look like, in my estimation, he just doesn't look like Lincoln.
All right. So,
And there's so many others on my Facebook page. If it's a public page, they spent 2 hours hyping this photo with this and that, and it kind of elevates it just by working it. And I thought it was important to put this photograph in my gallery of would-be Lincolns. And then I thought, well, I think I'll just put all these online. So I put them all online together. And the lost Lincoln takes a different perspective when you see it with all these other disparate pictures, most of which don't look at all like Lincoln. And it's a common thing, I mean, $50 ambrotype could be turned into something priceless. You could make a fortune if you can prove it. There was a daguerreotype that made it all the way to Christie's auction house that most of the history experts just scoff at, including me. And it didn't make the low bid, but still, if they had accepted 150,000, they could have gotten that much for that picture, and it just doesn't look anything like Lincoln. So I think that the Library of Congress, I interviewed Carol Johnson, the 19th century archivist, retired a few years ago. And kind of on her own, she brought up the thing I won't miss is dealing with people calling in saying, I have a photograph of Abraham Lincoln, and can you authenticate it? She said they happen about 3 times a month. And when she was retiring, she kind of spoke out to they had a little reception, and she said, okay, who's going to take over the Lincoln stuff? And nobody stood up. So it's kind of a subfield in itself, really. And like I said, it's certainly not the first one that's come along, or won't be the last. They're all fighting. The dealer who originally had it said his ex-wife stole it from him and auctioned it. He's suing the people who own it now. The people who own it now are suing the production company for the TV, saying they unauthorized use of the image. So, and they all believe it is. And there's almost all of the comments on my Facebook page were just, wow, this is ridiculous. So
the big bucks to be made, huh?
And yet, there are still lost Lincoln photographs. There are written accounts of Abraham Lincoln visiting some small town in Illinois. There's maybe, I don't know, 1 or 2, had his picture taken, had his photograph taken, and nobody's seen the photo. And maybe one day another one will surface that is real. So it's not like we say no to everything. And the discovery possibility with Lincoln is still there too.
Yeah. All right. So I've attended several images of war seminars in the past. Why would somebody want to attend such an event?
Well, if you're interested in photography, either modern photography, if you're interested in learning more about the photographs of the Civil War and why they were taken and what they showed, but you also want to go on a tour of a battlefield and hear about the battle, that's what we combine. So we specialize in that. And one of the things that we do that nobody else does that I think is really cool, and what Gary Edelman calls the 4D experience, is we create big poster-sized Anaglyph reproductions of original battlefield photographs, and we stick them in the ground at the place where the picture was taken. So you can stand there at the place where the original picture was taken and look at the original photograph and see the scene as well, the modern scene live. And that's what Gary says is a 4D experience, not only seeing the image in 3D, but being at the location and seeing it, where it was originally taken. And we have at every seminar, also in the indoor, the evening sessions, or we have a 3D show. We always have a show featuring Civil War photographs in 3D. And it really, like I said, the single most compelling visual thing that ties us to the Civil War and allows us to see the Civil War, unlike, say, the War of 1812 or the Revolution, is the photography of the war. And until the last 20 or 25 years, it wasn't really being tapped into the potential. The potential wasn't really being tapped into what these things could be and what they show. And that's what the Center for Civil War Photography has done, is to try to maximize the enjoyment, the historical value, and the wonder and the spectacular visual nature of the photographs that were taken of the war.
How can Civil War Roundtables and their members best support the center?
Just join. We have a modest $45 annual fee that supports us. Most of that money goes into publishing the Battlefield Photographer, and either join or come to a seminar. We'll be in Gettysburg next September 30th through October 3rd. That would be the best way to support us both and begin to tap into a really exciting subfield of Civil War studies.
So I put up a display of the center and its website, and I'm very interested in having more folks join and support the.
Well, you've joined. Have you found it to be worthwhile in terms of expanding your knowledge of what the photography meant to the?
Yeah, you bet. And the other thing is, it's really a lot of fun, and you get to see things and places that you may never have even known about, let alone considered going to. You bet.
Yeah, it's we've been to Gettysburg several times, and Antietam, but Fredericksburg, been to Chattanooga, we've been to Charleston twice, one of my favorite venues for Civil War photography. By the way, I don't know how many in your audience know, but the first photographers of the Civil War were Confederate photographers. George S. Cook, Osborne and Durbeck, Jesse Bowles, with his photographer Alma Pilo. All of them took, Cook didn't take pictures after Fort Sumter, but he took pictures of Robert Anderson holed up in Fort Sumter in February 1861. There were the photographers in the North, the Anthony Company was beseeching him, can you please get a picture of this Robert Anderson guy who's making so much news lately? And he succeeded, and they sold like crazy. So anyway, then right after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, they took both stereo and single plate, large plate images of the damage at Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, and got it started. The largest advertisement that I've ever seen in a newspaper from the Civil War, 4 photographs, is the Jesse Bowles Gallery double column display ad, basically, in a Charleston newspaper after selling his photographs from the aftermath of the bombardment of Fort Sumter.
Well, Bob, thank you very much for being with us today. And folks, if you will get out there and go on to ccwp.org, become a member, purchase some books, and we'll see you in Gettysburg in September of 21.
Well,
Thanks
thank
again.
you. Thank you so much for having me.